So today we have a good friend of mine. I've known him for many years. His name is Heron Breen. He's from the beautiful state of Maine. And he was involved with Fedco Seeds for about 25 years. So Fedco is one of the earlier organic seed companies in the United States. And they have also donated seeds to Albans in the community over the years that they passed out every year in the spring when they had their seed giveaway to the community. And over the years, there are different seeds that people have today. For example, you'll see it written as Mohawk cranberry bean, or Albans cranberry bean, or Onondaga cranberry bean. Well, it actually came from him, you see. But this bean is a bean that the people in the East Coast grew. So it doesn't necessarily just belong to the Mohawks, the Penobscot Indians, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq Indians. Everybody in the East grew this bean, and also the Iroquois people grew this type of bean. So without further ado, I'm going to have Mr. Heron Breen, formerly a Fedco seed, give a in general about the gardens, and any kind of questions that you have, raise your hand. Yell it.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and I really appreciate being here. We drove over from Maine. It's about a 5 or 6 hour drive. It's beautiful, and it's a wonderful time to be out. We are still in the middle of winter, so we can think deep thoughts before we get busy in the garden. And we can't think about anything other than getting things done. But that's kind of what this time is Stephen asked me to talk about garden planning and kind of how we would begin to think about the garden. And I know there's a lot of other folks here that are going to be speaking through the weekend who are going to talk about seed saving. And everybody has a different approach. There's always that saying that there's lots of ways up the mountain. So don't take anything that I say as this is the way it must be. It's just a perspective of how you can be. But a lot of gardening is about how you think about gardening. It's how you think about solving the problem. So training your brain to think about the problem differently if you're having a problem is really what gardening is about, and it's partly about being observant. So when we think about the garden, we think about the different crops that we might plant, and we have different parts of the garden that maybe we want to use. And I'm going to kind of draw a garden, and I'm kind of going to draw this as if it's this is the part facing us, and this is the part that's farther away from us. When we think about the garden, we're often thinking about how much light the plants need to grow. Those are the two parts. The first part is where is a good place to put a garden? And of course we have the sun and the moon, transiting, going over the garden. And we can decide to orient our crops. I'm going to say this is east, this is west, okay? Even though I don't think that's exactly where things are in the moment, but just imagine. And we can decide which way we want to place if we're planting in rows, for an example. So this is one of the first things we think about. How much light does the garden get? Most of the things that we think of as vegetables really would prefer to have 3/4 of a full sun day. So at least 3/4 of the day being in the sunlight. Now that means that, there could be in the morning a little bit of shade, or in the afternoon a little bit of shade, but that's what plants eat. Plants are the oldest living beings on this planet, and they eat sun, which is pretty fascinating. And we eat them, so indirectly we're eating the sun. So there's a couple different ways if we're thinking about orienting rows, if we're thinking about planting with rows. You can plant or orient your rows so that your rows are running north-south, okay? Now that is a way so that when the sun transits over the garden, basically the whole plant gets sun. Now if I'm going this way, there's some shade cast all day on the northern side, basically. So if we orient our garden so that the rows are going north-south, each side gets an equal balance of sun. Now sometimes you don't have this luxury. There's plenty of times where I planted this way and it works just fine. What I find is if I'm orienting, if I decide to go east-west with my rows, I want to give more space between those rows and maybe even between those plants. And this has something to do with the next element that's play. Here we're talking about light, and the next thing we're talking about is wind, airflow. So part of the cycle of the day is the dew, and then in the morning, and then the sort of the dew at night. And ideally, we want the plants to be able to dry out on a good day. And that airflow helps reduce disease. Many of our crops, when we think about farming and gardening are different, or at least they are now. In many situations, you'll see a big field of green beans if you're looking at a farm, and the rows are very tight, and the plants are very close. And what they're doing is a lot of times they're planting a specific variety of green bean that's resistant to a bunch of diseases but doesn't taste good. But that's because they're trying to pick it with a machine. So they don't pick it by hand, they have a machine that goes and picks all the green beans. The beans don't taste good. They're green, but they don't taste good. They taste stiff, they taste like wood. But they also spray the beans. Or there's a disease, there's a pesticide that's actually planted with the bean. That's either around the bean or planted in the row with the bean that makes the plant basically resistant to diseases the whole season or most of the season. So they get away with something that us as gardeners we can't do, or we have more difficulty doing. They're basically spraying for diseases and pests throughout the entire season. And that basically means that they don't care about this wind or airflow thing that we should worry about as gardeners. So they have very tight rows. And if one of the things we find is that our older classic or traditional varieties are not really meant to be planted that close. So the older or classic traditional varieties are meant to be planted farther apart and have more airflow. When we try to emulate sort of the bigger farming stuff, we run into trouble because they're either getting sprayed or they're basically a disease-resistant variety that doesn't have the flavor that we would like to have in our garden. So this airflow is very important. So it's both the orientation of the row, it's also the distance between the rows. Sometimes when we're planting in the garden, we can be planting twice as far apart in the rows as a farm might be packing things together. We also might be having less plants in a row, so there might be farther distance between a row. So again, for green beans, on a farm, I might be planting, the green beans the rows might be 2 feet apart. And those plants basically grow and they pretty much fold right into each other, which just creates a big moist environment where all kinds of diseases can take place. If I'm planting an older or more traditional variety, I might want to have 3 and maybe even 4 feet between my rows. So I might be doing double or a third more than a farm because I want that flow. Now in that row of the green bean, I might also, if I was a farmer, I might be planting those green bean seeds every 3 inches. So I might be having a plant every 3 to 6 inches if this was on a farm. But in my own personal garden, we try to have our beans 2 feet, a foot apart, our bean plants, because that allows the whole plant to grow and set pods in lots of different directions. And if it's a pole bean, we've actually found that 2 feet apart, we get as many beans off of plants that are planted 2 feet apart as plants that are packed together. And the plants are healthier. Now, the folks, we're just talking about growing garden, but if we're talking about seed, where we want to learn how to grow seed, these same principles of farther apart also apply. because as those plants grow and mature past the stage when we eat them, so a lot of times we're eating a green bean at its immature stage, we would call it immature seed stage. If we want that to grow and dry down, it needs this extra space and extra room so that those pods don't rot, so that they can continue to dry with this airflow. So we find when we're trying to think about planting our garden, that planting our garden with this extra space, with these kind of concepts in mind, that helps us grow better seed. Well, I'm not talking about seed in this moment. Thinking about these things also works that way. So these are the elements that are in play, but then there's this other element, which is your soil. This is the wonderful thing that we have to grow our plants. And this, everybody's dirt is different. It's different everywhere. Everyone has a different starting point. So it could be clay, it could be sand, it could be silt. And even when it's perfect, there's always things that we want to think about. The primary things that we like to think about is something called the pH, which is the acidity of the soil. A lot of our vegetables like the pH to be around 6. So it's kind of like 6 to 6.5, which is kind of considered to be in the middle. So 5 pH is kind of what potatoes prefer. Potatoes prefer an acidic soil. So blueberries would prefer 5 or a little less. Potatoes prefer around 5 to 5.5. But things like corn and squash and beans and all those other good crops, cucumbers, they like between 6 and 6.5. Sometimes you have a soil that's what they call naturally alkaline. So soil has acid and alkaline. Those are the two kind of ends of the spectrum. Alkaline is like 7 pH, 7 above, and that means that it has a lot of calcium usually. So usually what we understand about sort of soil is that soil that's very rich in calcium is very high in the pH scale, whereas soil that's less rich in calcium and has a lot of sulfur is more acidic. Sulfur and calcium are both really important, and what we're trying to do is find that balance in the middle. So finding out what your soil's pH is actually quite important. So there's home tests that you can buy at various different garden stores or hardware stores. You can also take a soil test. Sometimes there's kits you can buy at your hardware store or garden store, but also it is useful to take a soil sample and send it away to understand some of the things that maybe your soil test that you get from the garden store might not be able to tell you. But the biggest elements that we're concerned with are calcium, magnesium, and I'm sorry my handwriting is small, there's phosphorus, something potassium. I have horrible handwriting. I had great handwriting in 3rd grade. It never got any better. That's when it stopped. And people say nitrogen, but a lot of times in our garden, what we're looking for is something actually more in the lines with something called organic matter. So there's a few other things. I should put sulfur up here. It's important. Sulfur, although it's the thing that makes our garden acidic, it's also the thing that helps break down all these other things like sulfuric acid. So it's natural in the soil and it's occurring and it makes all these things available. So there's basically chemistry occurring in your garden. The calcium is what basically helps the cell structure. So strong cell walls and strong leaf and strong fruit walls and things like that. So if your soil has good calcium and magnesium, you're looking at having a very good healthy plant. They're less disease susceptible because they have this strong cell wall. And if folks know, like sometimes you'll have tomatoes, if you're growing tomatoes, and they'll have what's called blossom end rot, which is the very bottom of the tomato starts to have this soft spot. And that's a deficiency in calcium. Now, phosphorus and potassium are also important for things like fruiting, flowering, and other parts of the plant's health. Potassium is something that we traditionally have gotten from wood ashes. Okay, And then phosphorus is something that's traditionally been gotten from things like bone ash or bone char, or things that are that was kind of the traditional way of getting that. And then nitrogen, that's been traditionally been things like manure, but also things like cover crop. So there's things like beans and field peas and other types of things that you can plant that bring nitrogen into the soil. Organic matter is kind of a little bit nebulous in the sense of what it means is it's kind of like I guess I would say it's kind of like the living structure of the soil. And it means that it has all these different particles that help maintain this balance. So this organic matter basically helps sort of maintain all these nutrients and basically keeps them from getting like washed away or run away. What I found with organic matter and one of the garden or the fields that I work with, when I first started working with it, I remember bringing my girlfriend there at the time, and she said, "You're crazy, this is a gravel pit." And that was the end of that relationship, because she was like, "I'm not having anything to do with you, you're trying to farm a gravel pit." Well, it started off at what was called 3% organic matter, which is quite low, and now it has 6.5% organic matter because I've worked with it over the course of 20 years. These things don't change overnight, but the goal with gardening is just like we're growing every year, we're taking care of our soil every year. And the difference between 3% organic matter and 6% organic matter is now when there's a drought, my plants don't suffer. And a lot of other people have really bad issues. Or when it's raining, my plants don't suffer, and a lot of other people have bad issues. It's with the organic matter being in a good balance or high, I don't have issues with either drought or too much water, which is kind of shocking. And I never thought I would get to that point. But honestly, the soil now looks kind of like chocolate cake rather than gravel. And it just took time, and as Holly will tell you, like basically the answer to that was compost. I pretty much spent a lot of time and energy on compost and manure over the course of about 5 or 6 years, and at the 6th year, it was like night and day. And now it's one of these things where I can really rely upon that to really yield in all kinds of weather and all kinds of seasons. And the plants are healthier, and they're more resistant to diseases and insects, because insects can tell when the plant has a deficiency. So they will go to those plants that are struggling or under stress. So if your soil is balanced, you're less likely to have those issues. And the same thing with diseases. Diseases affect more plants that are having imbalances than they do plants that are not having imbalances. So when you think about how we work with this, these are the elements that we take into consideration. But again, this stuff right here, it's important not to try to change things overnight. Sometimes folks basically try to throw all the things they possibly can in a garden, and that can sometimes actually cause the opposite effect. So it's good to kind of go gently and nudge things in the right direction. And compost has a lot of this stuff suspended in it already. So you kind of are doing a good thing by kind of using the compost. So those are the elements that I start with. Any questions before I continue? Okay. So the next thing I'm thinking about is, where am I going to plant things in this beautiful garden? And again, I'm using that same trapezoid. And there's a couple different things to think about. And one of them is, where am I going to put the things that I want to plant early? And this is actually something you want to think about in the fall or in the summer before. Like basically at the end of the season, you want to be thinking, spinach, which can be planted very early in the spring. Lettuce, which can be planted very early in the spring. Peas that can be planted very early in the spring. I want to be sure that when I wake up in the spring from my long winter's sleep, that there's a spot basically ready to go to put those things in. So you want to be thinking, how do I have an early spot? So this is, I would call, the early spot. Now what the great thing about the early spot is The early spot is also going to be your late spot. So this is how this gets to be fun, is your early spot's going to have your lettuce and your spinach and your peas. But when those things get done, say in the middle of June or the very beginning of July, this gets to be your late spot, where things like carrots and beets for the fall, things like possibly kale or cabbage and other things can go in here. So there's a little bit of how you think about this is we use our mind to think about time. It's a little bit of a quantum planning, where you're saying this is where things are going to start, but actually in the middle of the season I'm going to have a transition. So we want to know a little bit of we want to have an early spot because everybody loves to pick peas. Whose kids don't love to go out and pick snap peas? A happy kid is a kid picking snap peas, in my opinion. So then there's a next kind of thought of okay, well then when things get warm, so these are the things, and you might be planting a little earlier than me. In Maine, central Maine, we have a shorter season than you. But these are the types of things I might plant on May 1st, or a little before, maybe April 15th if it's a good season. You folks might be able to plant spinach earlier than me. But then there's the next types of things that like it when the soil is warm. So things like beans, things like corn, things like squash. So they all like things when the soil is warm. And they also have to think about, okay, some of these things, I'm making this into 4 sections, but it could be as many sections as you needed. Really, you don't have to think about it this way. But I have to think about this light a little bit of what's going to shade out other things. That's important to think about. But obviously, corn takes a longer season than green beans. Okay? And it's going to be sort of sitting, taking care of that for quite a while. Whereas the green beans, you can do something called successions. So successions just means, and I'm probably going to spell this wrong, so Google that if you have to, sorry. It just means planting repeatedly. It means that you plant your green beans and you'll have a crop of green beans. And at a certain point in the season, they start to kind of not bear very well, or they get kind of pithy, or the plants start to look not so good. And then you can basically plant a little bit of green bean every 2 weeks. And that way you'll have green beans pretty much all through the year. So rather than planting one big long row of green beans, I can say, I have this section set aside for green beans. And I can plant it 6 feet at a time. Okay? So I can plant the first, 6 feet. And I'm sorry I'm using feet because in the United States we don't know anything. We use the we don't know how to measure or take temperature or anything. So I plant my first 6 feet, and then 2 weeks later I plant my next 6 feet. So I kind of have my row already decided, and I kind of can actually mark it out into the sections that I want. And so basically I could have 2 rows of beans set aside, and I could be planting this every 2 weeks. And you could be planting green beans if you really like green beans. You could plant green beans August 1st and still be picking green beans in October. So it just depends on kind of what you like, So, but the great thing about it is, let's say I plant 6 feet, and, that goes for maybe 3 or 4 weeks of picking. I can take out these plants, or rototill them in, or however you're managing it, and then I can plant lettuce there, or something else that's a shorter season, because lettuce comes really quick. So this is something where every time one of these rows with this little bit of green bean goes away, I can plant something else there that I might want, whether it's something if you like cilantro or whatever it is. You can plant something that's a really quick thing. So this succession thing is another way of thinking about the garden in kind of a 3-dimensional, or I should say 4-dimensional way. We're thinking about space, but we're also thinking about time. So corn, as I said, is a crop that, let's say this is where the corn is. This is a crop that's probably going to be here the whole season. And so that's a little bit of something where We want to make sure that ground is perfect. We want to make sure these things that are going to be there for a really long time have everything that they need, because they're going to be eating from the soil and from the sun the whole time. Same thing with potatoes. They're going to be there the whole season. So in a way, we're kind of making that right the first time, and our goal is to really just try to take care of it. There's other crops that, for an example, this early-late thing, it might be something where you really love cabbage or you really love broccoli, okay? And you can have broccoli in the spring and you can have broccoli in the fall. So if I wanted my spring broccoli, you see this second row of beans? See, this is the first row of beans that I'm thinking about. Oh, okay, this is the first little planting. Well, I could put spring broccoli in this row right here, this second row. And that spring broccoli is going to be done by about June or July. And I can take out that broccoli and then I can put beans there, because I've got spring broccoli, and then my fall broccoli is going to go over here in this late section. Or I could put the fall broccoli where these beans that had already gone went by. And these beans that went by, they're nitrogen fixing, and they put nitrogen in the soil. Nitrogen fixing means the plant itself has an association with some bacteria and is actually taking nitrogen out of the air and is fertilizing the soil. So I can actually, after I planted this first stretch of green beans, I could put broccoli here for the fall. So I'm thinking a little bit more than just one thing going one place. And that's how I can take a small, say 30 by 40 garden, I can get a lot out of it through the season. There's other things like tomatoes and peppers. And those things also take a very long season. And they're also kind of in the same place the whole time. But I like to put the tomatoes and peppers near each other because they're in a certain crop family. So this is another element of how I look at the garden. We have this word succession, which means one thing following the other. And we have this other word that many folks are here familiar with called rotations. And that means that I want to move some things around every season so that the tomatoes and the peppers are not in the same place that the tomatoes and peppers were in the year before. And so I try to put them kind of all in one section so that then I can rotate them to the next section. And I can go around like this. And that way, each of these things eats different types of nutrients. So tomatoes likes more of something than, say, broccoli likes. Okay? And so as I'm continuing to feed this garden, I'm also realizing that when the broccoli is in one section, they're taking more of something. When the tomatoes come to that section, they're taking something else. But if I put the tomatoes and peppers all in the same place every year, they tend to take to the point where this is empty of whatever it is that they like, which is usually phosphorus. They're a big fan of phosphorus and magnesium. So we try to rotate these crops around, and that does a couple things. It helps us balance how we're managing the nutrients in the garden. It also helps us balance diseases and insects. So as we move things, we're kind of helping to do that. So this is like kind of just, again, there's a bit of like a four-dimensional element to the garden. There's the space, there's sort of this element of like the sun, the wind, then there's this nutrient element, then there's this element of time. And the last element is really what we call management. How are we going to take care of the garden, and what is our way of doing that? My experience has been more in the realm of making sure there are no weeds. I'm a very no weeds person. And that's kind of how we try to keep everything really no weeds. We don't use any herbicide. I also don't irrigate in my garden. That doesn't mean that other folks shouldn't or couldn't. Depends on your soil. What I've discovered is that organic matter thing is the thing that really helps me. And also I plant with the weather. So I wait until it rains to plant the corn, or I'll plant the corn right before the rain. I'll wait to transplant my broccoli till right before the rain. I found that if I push it, then there's a chance that the things are going to get stressed out, and then I've lost I've lost something. So if something doesn't work, I only have one season, and then I'm back to the grocery store buying my broccoli. Part of this is knowing when, if you're going to irrigate, and how. So there was a year, about 4 or 5 years ago, where I was trying to put in corn, and it just was not raining. And what I did was, instead of using drip tape, which is something where it's a little bit of a little piece of plastic that has little holes in it, and the water runs through it like a hose, and it drips a little bit of water, I used a spinner sprinkler like you might use on your lawn, and I wet this whole area and soaked it, and then planted the seeds. Because actually you want the whole area to be saturated, and you want it to be warm enough. So this was a whole dry section that just hadn't rained, and I knew if I put the corn in there and it rained a little bit, it would sprout and then it would just die because their soil was too hot. So I soaked the area, then planted it, and a week later it did rain. But if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have had any corn. So there's some elements of how you manage water. For another example, if it rains a little bit, but not enough, that's when I would irrigate. I would give it a little more water than the rain gave it. There's something in the soil called capillary action. And this is how water is like a chain, and it pulls itself together as a big web. And when it rains, it naturally creates this capillary web of water flowing in the soil like little tiny rivers. And I want to maximize that. So if it only rains half an inch, but it really were 2 inches down, then if I was going to irrigate, I might irrigate this with another inch, because that kind of creates that. Whereas if I wait till it's really dry and I'm trying to kind of save things, that doesn't work in my experience. My experience is don't wait till things get crisis. If you need to irrigate a little bit and just keep things relatively balanced and moist, and then intervene when you have rain as your helper. So rain is just like such a natural, beautiful thing, and it brings not just water but also nutrients to the ground, that if we just kind of work with that, it's way better than, okay, I'm waiting, and now the corn is looking stressed, and now I'm trying to irrigate. So our goal is to work with the plant and deal with the situation before the plant starts to have stress. And that's just something you learn from experience. It's not something that, like, without just being out there and touching it and feeling it and seeing it and being part of your soil and where you grow. But you can tell when a plant is stressed. And so you learn it by saying, well, geez, I didn't do anything and now the plant is stressed. Next year I won't do that. I'll do something different. So it's a learning experience. But this element of like these rotations, the successions, and this kind of how we might manage water. The one last part of this management is the weed control thing that I was talking about. I try to do this thing. It doesn't always work. You see how all these rows are all going this way, which is that north-south orientation that I was talking about, where this would be south and this would be, well, that's an N, I think, upside down N. I actually try to have it so that all of my rows lead into each other, even if there's a break between them, because if I'm going to use a rototiller or even a hoe, or there's something called a wheel hoe, which is basically kind of looks like a bicycle tire. There's handles and there's like a hoe or rakes underneath it, that I can just basically go up and down the whole garden. Sometimes what we end up doing is we plant a section and we plant another section, and we kind of don't think about the fact that they could all be in one way. And if we think about it and we think in advance, even though this is going to be corn and this right now is spinach, if I have the spinach row and the corn row already planned out, I can actually really easily cultivate this rather than having them all jigger-jaggered all over the place. So that's one technique that I've learned that has really helped to me. It saves time, because you can use the same tool. And of course there's some spacing that's different, like I haven't even talked about squash for an example, but I'm more talking about crops that we naturally grow in rows, like beans and corn. You can pretty much space all your crops to pretty much the same row space apart. That same spacing that works for broccoli is the same spacing that works for corn, is the same spacing that works for beans, is the same spacing that works for carrots. You can plant your carrots closer, but the closer you plant your carrots, the more likely you're going to be on your hands and knees with your fingers weeding. So you have to ask yourself, am I going to do hand weeding, or do I want to use a little scuffle hoe? Be honest with yourself. Everyone plants things and thinks, I'm going to do this and this is going to be awesome. And then about August 1st, everyone's like, I give up. So the goal is to avoid the give up stage and have faith in your humanity. You want to be able to get through this. Your goal is, you've made a commitment to these plants and this garden. And even if these rows are very far apart and you're using a rototiller to go up and down them, if you get something and you're able to eat it and share it with others, you've succeeded. So it doesn't really, the goal here is to be successful. It doesn't really, in my mind, there's no perfect version. I wish that we could all be out here on our hands and knees picking every single weed, but that's not necessarily realistic if you have a job or a family that you're trying to attend to on a daily basis, so that's harder. So this, how we set up our rows. I also do a thing where, if this is lawn, let's say around this, I try to make sure this is really well mowed, because mice and voles and slugs and all kinds of wonderful stuff are going to want to get in my garden, because that's where all the good stuff is. And I also try to keep a buffer, which is basically, here's the garden edge, and I might have a 2-foot rim around the garden where I don't have anything planted. And if I do that, it keeps all the grass from encroaching into my garden. A lot of times we have a lot of grass, quack grass and other runner grass that will get into the garden, and some of that's really hard to take care of. And I found that if I have this rim, and if I keep this mowed, I can just rototill right around, or even just with a hoe, go around the edge of a small garden and take care of that. The weeds, the grass, eats all the nutrients in water. You can actually see, if it rains, how quickly the part that's next to the grass dries out, because the grass just sucks the water away from the plants. So you'll see that if you have lawn and you have stuff planted right up to your grass, that stuff at the end, they call it the edge effect, is not going to have good nutrients. So the end of the row is going to not be good. So the way you kind of reduce that is by having this kind of edge effect, where you keep the grass at bay and you're allowing your plants that are inside that kind of picture frame to have the best of what they can have. So those are the sort of elements for me that I think about when I'm trying to plan a particular garden. In terms of seed saving, which I'm going to leave to some other really good folks that are here, but my one advice is, get really good at growing a certain crop. If you love a certain thing, become good at growing corn, or become good at growing beans. Then learn how to seed save it. I think sometimes we are trying to do two things at once, which is learn how to garden and learn how to seed save. And those two things are really both powerful, but the first thing is learn to know the plant. Get good at what that plant needs. Understand how it grows in your season. What I have learned is not everything grows well where I live. And there's varieties, like for an example, there's pole beans that ripen in where we are in Maine and dry down, and I can get great seed. There's other varieties that I would love to grow, but they don't ripen and they don't dry down. And so I can't grow those. So I have to be happy with what I can grow, and the bounty of what I can is much greater than the lack of what I can't. You know, so we have to we sometimes get fixated on what we can't do, like we can't grow orange trees, but we can grow other things, you know. You've noticed in this, I haven't talked anything about greenhouses. I haven't talked anything about those types of things. the farm that the work that I do, I don't use any greenhouses except to grow seeds. I'm sorry, to grow seedlings. I don't have tomatoes in greenhouses. All my tomatoes are outside. I think that the thing about tomatoes, I guess this would be one good hint, is that in market farming, there's this type of tomato growing that folks use, and they call it the Florida weave. And it's not a hairstyle that I wish I could get. It's actually a type of trellising of tomatoes. And this is an example, like I was saying about the beans, about planting them close together. If you're at a market farm, you'll see these tomatoes, and the tomato plants are planted basically every foot apart, and they're all woven in together. That doesn't really work in a garden scale if you want healthy plants, because in Florida, they have a certain type of tomato. It's called a determinate tomato, just like you have bush beans and pole beans. There's determinate tomatoes that grow about waist high, and there's indeterminate tomatoes, which are normal types of tomatoes, and they just keep growing as long as they want. In Florida, they only grow the determinate types, and they spray them like crazy, and they're all disease resistant, and they're the ones that taste like cardboard that show up at the store. That's what they use to grow this. They have a system, and if you want to have tomatoes that taste good, it's better to have tomatoes individually on stakes. Sometimes as far as 3, we use 4 feet apart between our tomatoes. And one plant will produce beautiful tomatoes. And then if we need to use some kind of spray for some kind of disease, like late blight, which is a tomato disease that can happen in the fall, then I can spray them individually. With that Florida weave process, the tomatoes will look like this. It looks like a hedge of tomatoes. And that airflow thing we were talking about, there's no airflow. And they just get diseases. And you have to spray them all the time. So it's an interesting thing. About 20 years ago, everybody started using this Florida weave mentality. And guess what? Everyone started getting tomato diseases like crazy. And then everyone said, geez, we can only grow tomatoes in our greenhouses. It's like, well, yeah, but if you had just done that, rather than you went to this and then you said, oh, I have to have a tunnel to grow tomatoes. It's like, no, we do this and we do okay. So it's how we manage it, and sometimes we're being told to manage things in a way that isn't suited to our region, and that's important to know. So sometimes the older ways are better. It doesn't mean that new ways are bad. But this older way of having individually staked tomatoes that are upright is better than this new version, which is based on a production system that's not adapted to us. So these are just things, like a lot of what I'm showing is how to see the thing you're doing. It's not about the specific answer. Gardening is about showing up every year. And I think, as Archie was telling me today, have faith that you can do it, because hundreds of thousands of other people before you have, and it's just about seeing it and allowing yourself to see it. Sometimes that requires failure to learn. And you sort of like start to think about your garden. I am thinking about, in my garden, from the day I put a seed in the ground, I'm thinking in spring, I'm thinking about how I might do this different the next spring. It's like a constant kind of thought process where I'm like, maybe we'll do this, or maybe I should have gotten this in a week earlier, or maybe I should have waited. And I'm constantly thinking about that, which is why I don't have TV or Facebook or anything like that, because that's what's in my mind all the time. And that's what I have to share this morning, unless Stephen has other things that he'd like to ask me.
I got a question.
Yes.
You said, and I didn't even talk about squash yet. So
I didn't talk about squash or potatoes.
You want to just say something about squash?
Well, the great thing about squash and potatoes is they're pretty adaptable and can be put in a lot of different areas of the garden. But I found actually with potatoes that a couple years ago, a friend said, challenged me to grow potatoes without hilling them. And I used a method where I used hay, and I continued to bury the potatoes through the season and got like beautiful, perfect potatoes. And I just literally just like stuck them on the ground and buried them with straw over the season. And I had to kind of make them a little farther apart just to be able to use the straw to get, or not straw, the hay to get around them. I found that potatoes, because they really like this acidic soil, and but sometimes they're a great thing to kind of have as you've opened up a new piece of ground, or it's like you're expanding the garden, or it's an area of the ground that you want to, in a way, like, I do this with squash also. It's kind of like a way to kind of mulch the area. Like with squash run everywhere. So a lot of times what I'm doing is corn, because I really take care of the weeds in the corn, the next year I have less weeds. And that actually is better if I want to grow like carrots and things like that in that piece, because I've already knocked down the weeds a bunch. So a lot of times what people are doing is, in our area, they're doing potatoes and then corn, or they're doing squash and then corn. Because squash is a really heavy feeder, and the corn the next year benefits from that. But squash can be relatively successful with things like mulching with hay and things like that, so you're going to add some good organic matter and kind of build the soil. So potatoes are an opportunity to kind of break new ground or build soil. Squash is an opportunity to break ground. They're a little less concerned about everything being perfect. So if you have a section you're still working on, squash is a good place to put there. And then you can basically, it helps the soil get better, and then you can move into something like potatoes. So for me, it's squash, potatoes, then corn. That's how I work my rotation. I also grow a lot of garlic. So garlic is also part of that. So there's a couple crops that are heavy feeders. So squash is a heavy feeder, garlic's a heavy feeder, corn is a heavy feeder. And it's a little bit like, if I feed the garlic, then I can put the squash there the next year without a whole lot of extra manure or food, because it has a lot left over from the garlic. Okay? And then I can put the potatoes there, because the potatoes need less nutrients than the squash, but they're still happy. So I'll do corn, which feeds a lot, then garlic, which feeds a lot, and I'll kind of feed those, and then the squash can just go there, and I basically don't have to do anything, because the nutrients are really high, and they'll eat tons of it, and then it'll be ready for potatoes. So that's kind of how I think about, I move from crops from one to the other. And, or you could do, sometimes, like I said, I'll do corn, and then you can think about putting something like carrots there, because you've dealt with a lot of the weeds that are present in corn. So you could do carrots, you could do corn, carrots, garlic, squash. You can kind of move things around based upon this light feeding or heavy feeding. But the opposite of that is, I wouldn't want to go from squash to carrots, because I'm not really weeding as much with the squash, and there can be a lot of weeds in that section. So it's like I'm kind of not trying to not fight uphill if I don't have to. So those are the types of things where I'm thinking about what is the needs of each crop nutritionally, but also how am I managing it, and how do I want to follow what I might call a clean cultivated crop with another crop that can benefit from that lower yield, lower weed bank. So the more I weed, the less weeds there are. But if I let it go for a season, like squash, I do a certain amount of weeding and then I let it go, because it just vines everywhere and I can't get in there without crushing the squash. So that's a situation where it becomes kind of nature's cover crop, or I can even, there's this other thing I didn't say, it's called cover cropping, which many of you know of. Cover cropping is basically where I'm intentionally using something like a winter rye or peas or vetch or something to build this organic matter, and also kind of rotate things. So it's not something I'm eating, but it's almost like I'm resting the ground.
So if you want to protect your squash patch from weeds, you could do the cover cropping, and then you're going to sort of like weed out the weeds by planting your cover crop?
Well, some people do that. Yeah, there's a way to do squash where you will do something like oats in the fall, and oats as a cover crop. So you plant oats in like August, and they turn into like a nice, really grassy patch, but they die with frost. Hard frost will freeze, will kill the oats, but they basically create this mat of organic matter. And then you can come in and you can plant your squash into that dead mulch. So you have sort of dead mulch from that cover crop. It's also giving nutrients to where the squash will be. And then you can do that. So there's ways, these sort of advanced ways, of using this system of rotation to use cover crops, to use your crops, to follow things based upon their nutritional needs. And honestly, we're learning all the time. I've been doing this since I was a kid, and I still don't feel like I have the system down, per se. Like, we're always learning, maybe we should do this. I feel like beans are the kind of thing where you can kind of put them anywhere, in my experience. Like, if you're kind of like rotating and you're like, oh, you know what, I have a little space here, I want to put some beans. You know, I love pole beans. They're a lot of work, but we really enjoy them. And those I use pole beans kind of like a fence around my corn. So I'll have the corn section, and I'll have pole beans on each side of the corn as kind of like a natural fence. And at least it deters some of that. I do use electric fence for around the corn particularly because I have lots of skunks. It's not really the raccoons, it's the skunks for me. You can tell when a skunk's been in your corn versus a raccoon. The skunks tear the cobs down, they don't tear the plants down, and they like scratch the cob up to kind of, they kind of stand on their hind legs. So I have to use an electric fence wire around my corn. But actually Donna, who is with me from Maine, is my mentor and teacher, and for many years Donna had a sweet corn patch that was totally surrounded by pumpkins. And the edge was just all pumpkins, and you just had to make sure that you didn't make an obvious entry point into the pumpkins. So they had a little like what they would call stile, which is like basically some cinder blocks and a board, so that if you needed to get into the garden, you could get over the pumpkins, and then you could take the board away or whatever you wanted to do. But if you made a little hole in it, the raccoons would find their way in. But the prickliness of the pumpkins was keeping the raccoons and the skunks out of the sweet corn, which is pretty ingenious. So that's another technique, but the key was if you made a little hole, that was the end of that. They followed you in. And once they found their way in, they didn't find their way back. They were always going to find their way in. So the key was having this little kind of way to get in.
We literally grab the vines and pull and make it, close it in.
Close it in, yeah.
So that we can't cross it.
So rather than having them grow out from the plant, you kind of make almost like you pull them in so they're all fenced in lateral.
Just keep creating that barrier.
Creates a dense thing, yeah.
Yeah, because the vine will get so long it'll run off that way, but it doesn't protect the corn anymore. So if we pull it and then keep them surrounding it for 3 to 4 feet, seems to work good.
And have you found, for me, I've found that this technique works best with the pumpkins, not like the winter squash, like the buttercups or the Hubbards, but only really works well with a really prickly kind of pumpkin or zucchini, that kind of stuff. Is that your experience?
Practice spines on the other side.
Yeah. Some of the, right. Like the Hubbards don't seem to have any spines worth mentioning. Same thing with the butternuts. It seems like it's just tripwire, but not spiny enough.
They sniff it and it hooks their nose. They don't like it. Same thing with the deer. The deer won't cross either. See the pumpkins that are in it on the outside, but they won't cross into the corn.
everyone's biggest challenge is how to grow the corn so that the animals aren't in the corn. That seems to be the biggest challenge.
I grew corn my first year, I don't know how long back, but my first year, everybody in Ganawanaga, their corn was getting eaten by whatever was eating them, but mine was green and tall. But you know what I found? That I didn't have no critters. I planted marigolds all around my garden. And my marigolds were this high one time. So that, I think, saved my corn that year because everybody's corn was getting eaten and nobody produced corn.
That could work because the marigolds, I know in the past they used to extract a pesticide out of the marigolds. So that may actually, I think that's true. I think there's things like that. I think motherwort or mugwort is also stinky and nasty, and they don't love that. So you're right, there's definitely companion planting that can help with that.
I didn't buy the marigolds from the garden centers. I must have bought the marigolds from the garden center, but I saved the seed. I planted those seeds, but then they got all out of whack and they grew this high, so I just left them.
It's a fence.
1 year
and you still got corn.
Yeah.
I mean, I think sometimes, I always feel like the animals are very forgiving the first time you try something, and the next year they figure you out. Like if you put your corn, if you're the first time you grow corn, they might not harass you because they don't know you have corn there. But then like the next year they know you have corn. So it's, it's sort of, the other thing that happens, which if you start saving seed, and Holly was talking about this last night, if you start selecting, when you're saving seed, you'll end up selecting for things that taste good. Over the last 6 or 7 seasons, I've been selecting this butternut squash variety for all kinds of good things, including taste. And about year 5, suddenly the deer, I had never had to fence my squash in from deer, ever. I'd been growing squash in this field for 20 years. But the 5th year of selecting this variety, they skipped over all the other squash and just like ate that variety like it was popcorn. I mean, they were eating the squash when they were just little babies, biting them off the vine. And I had never encountered that before, and so now we have to fence in our squash because they won't leave them alone. So you'll find that when you select things to taste good, whether it's corn or anything else, the animals also know that you have created a wonderful, nutritious buffet for them. So it might be that bad tasting food is the best thing to resist bugs and deer. Thank you for letting me talk today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so that's very, very important information earlier that you talked about. I also plant in wind direction, so the wind mostly in my garden goes from east to west. So I make my rows from east to west, and I have pretty much sun all day long. And over the years, I experienced that with the beans. If the beans were about 2 feet apart, and when it rains a lot and it stays moist, the beans pick up a disease. So I started making my rows at least 4 feet apart so that the airflow will pass through. Even if it's not sunny and it's a little bit damp, just the air circulation will help keep the beans from picking up disease. So in the older varieties, as you said, they're more prone to disease. So that's why all the new modern hybrids are made to plant closer, this and that, and they taste like they're eating cardboard, which is absolutely what happens.